Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have with us Garrett Buvinghausen. He is the pastor of Resurrection Lutheran Church in Fredericksburg, Texas. Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd.
Thank you very much.
You contacted me probably a couple months ago. You had just read a book called Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Christ Voss. He's a former FBI negotiator and said, if you're looking for a book talk, this might be a good book to take a look at. And I hadn't read it, hadn't even heard of it. And you sent along some interviews that he had done, a masterclass link, things like that. So I got the book, read it, watched the interview that he had with Jocko Willink. And I have to say, I was astounded by how helpful I think this book could be in terms of, maybe being even a standard read in a pastoral practice course, just on how to talk and how to speak and what things to keep in mind. He ends his book with this request to all of those who are reading it. Whether it's in the office or around the family dinner table, don't avoid honest, clear conflict. It will save your marriage, your friendship, and your family. And I found that to be a really poignant way to end, and for us to begin, that so often our interactions at church and at home, wherever we are to avoid conflict. They're conflict averse. And when you're a negotiator, when you are trying to save a life, you can't avoid conflict. You have to dive right into it. And we are in the business of saving lives. And so make your best case biblically, theologically, on why someone should pick this book up and begin to try to employ what he says.
Okay. So yeah, I'd well, just real quick, it's kind of funny. I've been working with, I'm pretty new to being a pastor. I only started back in 2019, but with everything that's come since then, you've had to find a way to not only get to know your people, but get to know your people in a circumstances that are kind of strange and
conflict-laden circumstances.
Right. Yes. Conflict-laden or needing clarification.
Yeah.
And so, it's just kind of interesting how when I first started, it was before all the COVID stuff happened, and I heard about Christ Voss and the masterclass, and I actually took it and then read the book, and I've been giving this recommendation to people, mainly pastors, for several years now, and I'm glad you think it's so useful, because it really is. I mean, the best case I can make for it, and I'm trying to do my best not to be one of these guys that that tries to use scripture for reading a business, as the rationale for reading a business book.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you have to say, though, that this is actually very useful. Not everything in the book is useful for everything about being a pastor. He talks about getting the best price on, a car or something like that. But this is great because it is all about building rapport with other people. It is understanding what other people are feeling and putting a label on that and calling it out in a way that takes pressure off of them. And you're not doing it in such a way that says, hey, I think you're angry. You just go, it seems like you're angry right now. And they can have an opportunity to address it or whatever. And it's just a great tool for building relationships with people. And from what we're still recovering from of this huge disconnect from COVID and just this people being cordoned off into their own little worlds, face-to-face contact and talking to people, it just seems like whatever we can use to build on those relationships is helpful. And, we need to be wise about these things, of course. I think whenever anybody hears the term negotiation, they might think, well, then you're just trying to get your way, or you're trying to, get me to do what you want me to do. And it's just what I love about this book is that it's collaboration is what's important. And it's working with each other on solving the problem, which is the problem, not the other person. So,
Yeah. No, that's good. It's true. I always think, one of my least favorite things to do is to go buy a car. And I wish we could just go in and say, look, this is the most I'm willing to pay. And they would just say, well, this is the least that I'm willing to sell it for. Like, just upfront, let's just start. But that's just not how the world works. And I always feel like I'm being manipulated or I'm trying to manipulate. And so when first I kind of started reading this, I'm like, is this just like a manipulation tool? And as I was reading through it, it really wasn't. In some ways, it does kind of tap into, a person's feelings and doesn't manipulate their feelings, but just gives air for those feelings to be voiced or room for them to actually be acknowledged. So, of course, we'll have to be wise in not applying this in a way that would be manipulative or in a way that would be contrary to the ethics and morality of the scriptures. But nevertheless, there are some really helpful tools here.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I think what you started off with the quote about engaging in clear conflict. But clear and useful and beneficial conflict. It seems like so many people are conflict averse to the point where it's detrimental, and we avoid communication. And someone's upset with you and they don't tell you. How are you able to remedy the situation or anything like that, right? So sometimes we have to go and talk to people. Sometimes we have to go and clear the air. And sometimes we need tactics to be able to draw people out in a way that's not going to harm them, but in a way that's going to help us. Well, I think, this last Sunday on the 1 year, we had come to terms quickly, right? And so we need to come to terms quickly, and this is a way of doing that. And when we go through these tactics, it's, people are going to say, oh, okay, so this is this is going to be stuff like, okay, I don't like the way that you're saying it, or be mindful of your tone, but really these things are important. And we don't like to be tone checked, but at the same time, we need to discipline ourselves as pastors, especially to use our tone of voice and other tools that we can have at our disposal to make sure that if things are out of hand, that we rein them in a way that's not heavy-handed or in a way that's not detrimental. Or it's just it's stuff that's like, when you go through these tactics and these tools, it does require wisdom and humility. And a lot of these require you to check your pride. And I think that's a great opportunity for us as pastors to also lead by example on that front for our people, in showing that you can have clear conflict that's beneficial without everybody getting upset, or, while showing that you can have a collaborative nature in your discussions without saying, because who hasn't heard of the proverbial stories of, well, we need to build a fellowship hall, and you have some people who want it over here by this side of the building, and the other people on this side, and there's two camps and they are in conflict. And they don't really teach you in the seminary how to deal with those things and how to approach the people and deal with the feelings. And we'd like to we'd like to not think that feelings matter sometimes, but it's like this is very much a pastoral concern as well, to acknowledge the feelings. You don't have to agree with them, but acknowledging them makes a big difference. And this isn't just an application also for pastoral care. It's also, guys who are married and who have kids. This is a great tool for just the relationships you have on a day-to-day basis, with friends and everything as well, because it, we'll get into it a little bit here, but it's just a way of knowing or having the other person know where you stand and dealing with it in a way that is beneficial, or, just letting people know that you actually hear what they're saying and things like that. And so the thing is also some rationale for this. Some people might say that this is being winsome to win some, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of those phrases that's just, I don't know. It just really kind of gets stuck in my craw sometimes. Yeah. It just comes up so much. I mean, winsomeness, it's not important. It's just so overused on some level that some people might use that as something they can throw at this conversation to say, well, this is just, winsome to win some. Why do I have to pay attention to that? And you go, well, this is actually about being wise in the interactions with other people. And what Leah actually says in his pastoral theology, when it's kind of funny, he's talking about mainly a country parish. He makes a distinction between the country and the city. And he says the country parish is by far the hardest part. He says, because you have to, it's so difficult to get accustomed to the whole being and life of a congregation, to understand it and to know it's very important to make oneself be understood without giving up the tone and the way it is proper for a pastor to act toward a congregation, right? So oftentimes we want to be, and this is the struggle with being a pastor in a parish anywhere, is that you want to be friends with your people, or you have the temptation to be friends. And he talks about that as well, where when you're in a congregation, you have to be careful who you deal with right at first. And there's certain people that will hang back. I mean, that's kind of what we were taught at the seminary too, but this is a way to talk to everybody in such a way that you're maintaining the integrity of the office and also letting the other person know that you care about them. Some people think, I guess some guys think that they have to be very cold or calculated, or they can't get too close with the people for fear of the accusation of playing favorites or something like that. And that's a genuine concern. So these things kind of help with that a little bit, and it aims for us to engage in the clear, meaningful, and productive conflict, so that we can come to terms, so that we can sharpen each other without allowing things to grow in the dark and fester.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my rationale for all this. It's kind of a lengthy one, but I mean, I think it's needed because a lot of guys will probably shy away from a business book at first, but this one really has some good stuff in it.
Yeah, it's got a lot of merit. What I found really nice, quite compelling, is you brought up like the tone police or things like that, where we're often accused of not saying things in the right way, or not saying things in the most helpful way. And we hear it enough that we begin to dismiss it. And what I found really helpful from him is that he says, look, this is just the way the world works.
Right.
He just was very matter of fact that if you're going to have productive conflict, if you're going to actually have iron sharpen iron, if you're going to be able to come to terms quickly so that things don't fester and become infected, you just have to realize that all of our interactions are are not just on the substance. It's also in how you say it and even in your body language.
Right.
And so all of these things you just have to take into account. And while it's true that often people will dismiss you wrongfully because of what they perceive as tone, our response shouldn't be to be the drunken peasant that Luther says and fall off the ditch on the other hand, just go out and trying to offend people.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that to be just very helpful to say, look, this is the world that we live in, that we have always lived in, that only a certain percentage of people are actually really careful about listening to what you say. Really, they're listening how you say it and the body language that comes along with it. And you just need to be mindful of it. It doesn't mean you have to, always give in. It just, you have to be mindful.
Right.
And I think that was a really, really great takeaway for me. So in terms of like principles of negotiation, I think you already brought up the fact that Voss says the adversary in negotiation is not the person that you're sitting across the table from or the person that you're talking to, but rather it's the situation itself. Right. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly we have people that we so quickly want to elaborate on, okay, so people are against us in the church or in a specific congregation on a certain issue. Mm-hmm. And yet I think it's a very helpful shift of perspective to say, look, this person wants, whether it's in the church or in the family or whatever, this person is fighting for what they think is good and what they think is right. And so if they are adamant about what they think is right, you need to find out what that is. And, the adversary is that y'all aren't in concord. There's discord there that needs to be addressed so that you can see that person as a partner in this. And I really like that way that he said that you don't have the opponent on the other side, you have a partner and you work with each other. And so then the spirit of collaboration really comes through on that. And so you will do all that you can. With that in mind, you'll do all that you can to show the other side that you're in good faith, and saying, look, I know so it seems like you want the best for this church. I want the best for this church, and let's work together on that. Right. Or do you want the best for what's going on here in this event or something, this collaboration? You want the best? So do I. Let's see what we can do. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So this really goes along, it sounds like, with Luther's admonition in the Eighth Commandment to put the best construction on things or to explain everything in the kindest way. And I just would remind the listeners before they say, oh yeah, are you saying there's no evil? This is a guy who was an FBI negotiator in hostage situations who was saying this. Yeah. So he obviously admits that there is real evil out there, but if he's going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, he has to take that frame of mind. And so it really is kind of, it seems like a psychological trick, and maybe it is, but it just very helpful in framing the situation that I'm not dealing with an enemy. I'm dealing with a collaborator, a partner, that the situation itself is the enemy. And so this could also be St. Paul, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but the principles and powers of the air, things like that. So I found that really to be helpful.
Yeah. And I guess that is the proper, it's good to put the perspective on Christ Voss, because he dealt with murderous terrorists and things like that. And so how can you collaborate with a murderer? And you go, well, it's just kind of interesting. Well, if you want the best result, it's this whole thing of, it's kind of interesting. He's talking about the negotiations he would do, but the official, I think the official policy of the United States is that they don't negotiate, but he works with the family to talk to the people that kidnap their friends and everything like that. But there were people on the other side that were like terrorists, guerrillas, and everything. And yet when they saw them as a partner in trying to solve the problem together in those high stakes situations, they were able to, in some sense, it is a psychological trick, especially when life is on the line. You have to do what you can to keep the murderer at bay, right? But with us in more low stakes, I mean, I guess it should give us the proper perspective that while we're in the midst of a disagreement in the congregation, it is so much lower stakes on some level, at least in a temporal sense, that we're not actually dealing with a murderer on the other side. You're dealing with Gladys, who wants to put, something on the table that you think is inappropriate or something like that. So Karen or Tom or something like that wants to hold something at the church. That's fine, but there's an aspect of it that needs to be talked about, or it just depends on what it is, right? When you look at that person on the other side, this is a lot easier for us as Christians in some sense, because if we're all gathered together, ideally for the same reasons and the same causes, it's much lower stakes and makes it much, it's a lot simpler than a lot of the stuff that Voss had to deal with or anybody else in a business world might have to deal with. So,
yeah. So he calls it tactical empathy, right? That you become interested in what the other side wants, and what they want and what you want. That the situation, that's the enemy, not the person himself. And so you're trying to get what you want, and they're trying to get what they want, and going through with that in mind,
right? And I guess whenever you talk about tactical empathy, a lot of people will say, well, what good is that? And it might be because they're getting it mixed up with sympathy, right? That's not what this is. Sympathy is called for, I think even by St. Peter, he says it in one of his epistles, right? We should be sympathetic with each other. That is to suffer with each other, to have pity on somebody. The empathy that Voss talks about is about understanding what somebody's feeling. And the tactical part of it that he talks about is actually pretty clever, because he says you can understand what someone is feeling and not necessarily agree with it at the same time.
That was a really poignant point that he made, which was a really kind of not life-changing, but really changed. Really changed the way I thought about, because you're always afraid, it seems, that when you let those feelings from other people be aired, that you're automatically agreeing with them, and you need to you feel the need to shut it down, like that I disagree with that.
Yeah,
and he says, just to acknowledge it does not actually mean you agree with it.
Right.
You're just saying, well, I hear what you're saying.
Right.
Or I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
Or, it sounds like this is what's going on, but you actually haven't agreed to it.
Right.
And maintaining that distinction in your mind actually is helpful, because that distinction allows you to continue to move forward in good faith. That you understand that you're not agreeing to it.
Right. It allows you on some level to have some distance, or like the kind of distance that will be beneficial. It also allows you to put a check on whatever you're feeling, so that you can, because if someone's saying something to you, if someone's angry with you, right, let's just go with that one. If someone was upset with you and they're very clearly upset, he talks about this. You want to do what they do, right? That's why we so often are told not to respond in kind with the anger of other people, because it just breeds contempt. And so when you remember that, you can just simply say, seems like you're upset. And it sounds so funny when you tell people this, because I've told people this. I've tried to tell people these tactics, and they look at me like I'm crazy, because they just go, well, if I say that, then they're just going to get really upset. And you go, actually, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised what people will do when they're actually told on some level that they are being heard in such a way that isn't something, and we'll get into these tactics specifically. When you label them, I mean, it's hard not to get into them right away, because they all kind of mingle together. It's kind of this, it's like this web that you can weave with all this stuff. But it all goes together with acknowledging the other person in a way that you are clear, you're being as objective as possible. And the other person will appreciate that. And it's sometimes you really have to work at it, though. It's not just a one and done thing. It seems like you're upset and then they're not upset. It's like sometimes you really have to work at them, but it's cumulative on such a level to where the more they hear that you understand, the more they will, I guess, be deactivated in what they're feeling if it's bad. Right? So,
And it, as you said, it feels weird when you do it. It seems counterintuitive, but it is counterintuitive.
Right.
You tend to match those with whom you're speaking or negotiating or arguing with. You match that tone, and I know that I've been at the receiving end. I tend to get not angry, but very excitable.
Yeah.
Right. So it sounds like I might be angry. And I always have to tell people I'm not angry. I'm just getting excited. And I'm sorry if it's
excited for being yelled at.
But it's instructive that someone can respond to what I'm saying if I'm in a kind of one of those excited states in a very calm way, and how I immediately can think to myself, oh, I'm getting a little excited here.
Right.
I'm raising my voice a little too much. And when I think about that and put what he says into perspective with my own experience and how people have brought my emotions into check, so to speak.
Yeah.
I begin to realize, hey, there's something to this. And it, as weird as it feels and as silly as it sounds, it is in the end really helpful. So let's talk about his techniques, because you have tactical empathy, which is kind of the broad topic, but then there are the actual tactics, the techniques that are used to bring that about. So let's go through those techniques.
Okay. So first of all is voice. And like I said, tone checking. I mean, when it comes from somebody else, it's annoying, but when you do it yourself, it's actually very helpful. So the voice that's inside you becomes the voice that you speak, in some sense, that if you are feeling agitated, you're going to sound agitated. If you're wanting to be assertive, you're going to sound assertive. So achieving your goals in negotiation requires adopting, that positive collaborative mindset and the skills that go along with that. And the first one I think is very important is the voice, because when you talk about negotiations, a lot of times people will say, well, you need to be assertive. You need to say, this is my price. It's kind of like, go back to the car, buying the car example. You want to go in there and you just say, this is what I'm going to pay. That's all it's going to be. Done deal. And the other side, if it's assertive, sometimes that can feel like, a punch in the nose. If you're dealing with other people, it's like, this is the way it's going to be. That's all it is. Don't bother me about it anymore. That is counterproductive. In fact, Voss is very clear. He's like, don't use that ever. And I even saw a video one time where he, because sometimes they put out his company puts out these snippets from the training that he does with people. And there's one guy who's adamant that he needs to be on the phone with somebody else in like standing up, crouching over the phone, putting it in a, a submissive position so that he can be assertive and dominant in the talks. And Christ Voss just goes, if I had you on the phone, I would have my way with you on some level, because you would just walk right into everything that I would want you to do, because I'm going to be playful and accommodating, and I'm going to be calm. And you're the one who thinks that you're getting his way, but in the end, you're not, because you're blinded by your assertiveness, right?
Yeah.
And it's something to keep in mind. So he says, assertive tone is always counterproductive. Don't use it ever. I mean, some people will say, well, that just takes away all whatever sort of authority I might have. And you go, no, it actually doesn't. Because if you're accommodating or playful and you use that most of the time, it just allows the other side to kind of relax, I mean, as a pastor, if somebody comes up and says, Pastor, would we be able to do this? And you go, oh, that's interesting. Or you say, oh, that's interesting. The tone really makes a difference. You say, so what made you decide to do that? Is very different from what made you decide to do that. And it's kind of funny to talk about on some level. You do this role play stuff, but I mean, you have to kind of hear it, and you can even try it out. And he does talk about practicing these things, because otherwise you're not going to be in the practice of it. But if you do playful, accommodating tone most of the time, and then this other one that's kind of neat, late night, it's like the late night FM DJ voice. Use approximately like 10 to 20% of the time. That's usually if somebody's getting really upset. And he talks about how he was in New York as an FBI agent, negotiating with these people on the other side of this door in this apartment building. I think it was in Harlem or the Bronx or something like that. And he just used the late night FM DJ voice, over and over and over again, with other tactics of just labeling and whatever. And after hours, he said they came out, and it was a tense situation because they knew they had guns on the other side. They had armed, SWAT teams on his side and everything. Like, they were ready to go in guns blazing. And with that tone of voice, just the late night FM DJ voice, it's soft. It's kind of like, it calmed them down. And it de-escalated the situation, and it's actually very useful. But like, you use that when someone's really getting upset, and like I said, you have to use wisdom with this stuff. You have to understand what the other you have to really pay attention to the other side and what they're really feeling, or what they're conveying to you with how they're talking to you and how they're approaching you, so that you can know how you can respond to calm them down or to get them interested, right? Or something like that. Yeah. And then there's like the additional inflections on your voice also matter too. If you're inquisitive, curiosity for the other side's point of view should be the default. It's like you say, oh, that's interesting. What made you think of that? It's curiosity. And I've seen him also say this too, that when someone is upset with you, or they're coming at you because they are just raging with anger, he said one really good tactic for you on the other side of receiving that is curiosity. If you have the mindset of curiosity as what is making this person so upset, that can help you take on the proper tone of voice to say, hey, what's going on? And that it'll bring them down pretty quick, on some level, because if you don't meet it on their level, it helps to kind of de-escalate things. And then when you say that you need to have the assertive tone, the thing is that you can be declarative or declarative, whatever you want to say that, declarative about how you say things, and it's with the downward inflection, stating a fact. So you need to say, we're not going to do that. You just say, we're not going to do that, and he says, use that sparingly on some level, unless you really need to make that point. So anyways, so it's kind of funny. It's like, you don't normally talk about tone of voice. Well, we talk about, it's like, I don't like your tone of voice. It's like, okay, well then let's talk about what good tone is. And that's really helpful for this.
Yeah. And it's not just, what I find helpful here is he's not saying you just have to be nice.
Right.
And that's usually how it's used, in the world. I don't like your tone, or you get tone police because like, you're just not being nice. But in reality, there is a sense where we have to watch how we say things, because that's how people hear. So the first technique in this empathy is just be mindful of your own tone and use those tones, the playful, accommodating, the late night FM DJ voice. I actually laughed out loud when he talked about that.
Yeah.
And the inquisitive and the declarative, to use these tones and try to frame whatever you're in, whatever situation you are in, and prepare yourself to use those tones to de-escalate.
Right.
And actually be able to come to the table and discuss and not view them as an enemy. And so part of this is just really checking yourself before you even begin to enter into it.
Right.
What other techniques does he have?
He also has mirroring, and mirroring is, I think,
Mirroring?
yes, mirroring. Yeah, that's right. That's good. That's really good. Yeah, no, it's really funny because I didn't. It's so funny when you know these techniques and the other person knows the techniques. That's something else we probably should talk about too. Some people might say, "Well, why do you want to give all these things away? Shouldn't you just have them for yourself?" And you go, "No, because if people know the other side of things and they can reciprocate, that's exactly what you want."
Yeah.
The mirroring thing is great. That's great. You the mirror neurons, as he talks about, right? That bonding happens when people do the same things. If you're walking down the street with somebody, you kind of wind up walking in the same gait as the other person, right? Yeah. Or you seek to, or if somebody is happy, the other person talking to them is going to be kind of happy. And so it's like, if you feed off of each other in that sense, it builds a relationship, or it builds a connection, right? Mm-hmm. And so mirroring.
How much more important than too is this for like fathers and pastors who are like leaders within the family or the congregation, the church family, for them to set that tone so that others will follow as well.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, we're pastors, so we want to talk about this primarily as pastors, but with the family, it's tremendous. I mean, I have 2 kids, and my oldest is almost 3. She'll be 3 in August, and she's fairly verbose, and because that's, I think, typical for girls. But I will mirror her all the time, and she will just keep on talking, and that's the great thing about this. And it doesn't just work on 2-year-olds; it works on everybody. When you have someone say, they'll say something like, he uses this example that this guy, this is in the master class, I think, where he says there's a guy who goes to a conference and he wanted to just mirror everybody he came into contact with. And his wife got so annoyed because every time someone would come up to him and say, "Hey, this conference is great." And he go, "This conference is great?" And they go, "Yeah, we get to having a great time." He goes, "Having a great time? Yeah, the food's really, really great." "Food's great?" And it just went on from there, and they would just get, "Yeah." And they would go on. Right. And, and then his wife got really annoyed because everybody would come up to him and say, "Your husband is so interesting," which is hilarious. But he has this phrase in the masterclass. He says, that there's an old phrase, the interesting people are interested in what you're doing, right? And so this is to show that you are paying attention and interested in them, right? It builds rapport between the people. So like with my 2-year-old, or even my wife, and she knows that I do this, but at some point she stopped caring. Because she actually really likes it, where she'll say, or I'll say like, "So how was your day?" She's like, "Oh, it was good. The kids were a bit rough," or it's like, or "The kids were really good." And I go, "The kids are really good?" It's like, "Yeah, she did this, he did that, whatever. And it just builds on that. And I do it with, a lot of people. And I don't care that they know it because it helps. And like I said, if other people know that this is a good way to let people know how you feel, or that that you're paying attention, I mean, why not use it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He talks about how, at least in negotiation, the business side, that it's a way to get more information.
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked to others about this, like in terms of evangelism or even further discussion in elders meetings. It's a way to get more without being assertive and bringing up conflict. So it's a way to show that you're interested, you want to know more, but without asking questions in such a manner that seem accusatory.
Yeah. It's very helpful for that, because before looking back on your time, even though I've only been in 4 years or so, I can look back at my first year and say, I probably shouldn't have said that, or I probably could have done that better, or I probably could have, they didn't have a good reaction to me. And thinking back, I can see why, because I sounded accusatory in the way that I was asking or how I was asking. But so this is a great tool to say, all right, this is how I can do better with that. With the elders meeting, if someone's saying, someone's upset, you go, someone's upset? Yeah, well, they don't like this, that, or the other that's going on. You go, oh, they don't like that? Yeah, well, Pastor, it seems like whatever. It just helps you gain the information that you need, because without saying, it's like, well, who is doing this? What's going on? Whatever. It's a way to kind of lead the conversation a little bit to gain more of the information that you need, because that's what pastors need. We need information to do our jobs well. And the proverbial person that's upset, sometimes it helps to just say, oh, they're upset, and that's a good way of giving the other side the invitation to explain a little bit more without just asking a full length question. It's a nice little trick.
Yeah.
Not a trick, but a tool, it's neat.
Yeah. And without having to assume prior to, since you don't have much actual knowledge, a way to get more information without making assumptions or perhaps accusations. So, So I found that one to be very helpful.
Right.
The next one he gives is labeling. So what's that all about? Oh
man, labeling is he calls it like a Jedi mind trick. Which is it's gonna sound it's gonna sound funny, but
a Jedi mind trick?
Yeah, a Jedi mind trick. Yeah. Let me explain. Yeah, no, it's really great. It's giving a voice to the other side's feelings, which, like, we started off this whole thing saying that's just the world you live in. You have to deal with how people feel. And this is a great way to do it, because when you tell people, okay, so what he came up with is just brilliant. And it's funny, you'll say this and he'll just say, well, I'm just some dumb guy that figured it out. And I go, well, thank you, because this is brilliant. Because he just says, it's like, you give a voice to the other side's feelings not by saying things like, well, it's like, well, I think what you're saying is, I mean, we all remember that, the Jordan Peterson, talk that he had with that one lady like the BBC, and like the whole time she was going after him, saying things like, what I hear you say is, or I think what you're saying is, and she was using, the first person pronoun the whole time. And he just like kind of, I feel kind of bad for her, because it was a terrible use of the rhetorical skills on some level, because she was putting it all on herself. Right. And she was saying, I hear you saying this. I hear what you're saying is this, da, 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 da. And he says, take out the first person pronoun. It shows that you're the number one priority to the other person, and it makes them defensive, And so what he says is, use phrases like, it seems like, or it sounds like, or it feels like. So it sounds like you're angry. It feels like you're really confused, or, it seems like you don't know what to do with this,
Mhm.
and when you do that, it's objective. And he even puts it in the book, I think, if someone, if when you say this, like you said, it feels weird to try it at first, but once you get the repetitions in and you keep practicing in the low stakes conversations and whatever, you get used to it, and you actually find that it's a great tool to get the other person to either stop feeling the to either stop feeling the negative feelings that they have, or to give the amplification to the positive feelings that they have, so and if you're worried that they're going to say, don't tell me how I feel, then at least you can go back and say, well, I just said it seems like, you have kind of an out on that level. It's like it just seems like that. It seems like that, or it sounds like that, right? And then he says, don't be afraid of mislabeling, because if you mislabel someone, if you say, well, it seems like you're upset, they will correct you. They'll correct you and say, no, I'm not upset. I'm just a little whatever. And then you'll gain more of the information that you need to be able to proceed in counseling the person, or just dealing with whatever they're bringing to you. Yeah, it's. I just think it's brilliant. It's so useful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Then he has dynamic silence. What does he mean by that? And I think this is probably the most difficult thing for me to master.
Yeah, dynamic silence. It magnifies the impact of the mirrors and the labels. When you make a good label, be quiet. It's pretty much all it is. If someone's upset, don't say, and I know I keep using that, but that seems to be the one that everyone's kind of worried about. If someone's upset with me, or someone's distraught or something like that, you say, and I've actually used this with people who are grieving as well, right? It's actually very useful for that kind of encounter as well. It doesn't have to be just de-escalating someone who's mad at you. I've used it with people who are grieving and say, it seems like you really love that person. Mm-hmm. And then you be quiet. And that is hard, because you want to go on and say, it seems like you really love that person because they did this and that, and you just go on and on and on. But the best thing you can do is just be quiet. And if you mirror someone also, you say, like if they come up to you and say, hey, this conference is great. Oh, this conference is great? Yeah, because, it seems like you would, no, just leave it alone. Just let it land.
Let them respond. Give them time to respond.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that is hard, because usually pastors love to talk. So
I know that is a problem. Well, and we just talk
right.
We don't actually have conversations.
Right.
And at least not with our people always. We don't do it in Bible class that way. We don't, obviously the sermon is not the same thing, but most of our interactions are one way. And I would say probably on a weekly basis, right, where we're just talking at. We should do a lot more time having some silence so that we can gather more information and be able to apply the Word of God to what is actually the problem.
Right.
And that's part of what the prophetic voice is. Not just, we tend to think of prophetic voice as speaking about future things, but the prophets, more often than not, were speaking about current things in light of the Word of God and describing those things. And in order to do that, you have to be paying attention.
Right. Yeah.
So
funny that, huh? I mean, how can you preach about what's going on if you don't pay attention to what's going on? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
dynamic silence.
Yeah. Silence is golden in that sense.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And his final technique, he calls calibrated questions. Mm-hmm. I actually found this to be quite helpful too, in terms of reframing your questions and how and what versus why, which tends to be accusatory.
Right. And the way he puts it is, remember when you were a kid and you do something and your parents say, why did you do that?
Yeah.
What did you feel? Or if someone asks you, why did you say this? The immediate response is a defensive one. It's like you're immediately put on the defensive. And so calibrated questions are primarily how and what. He does talk about how to use why, but it's kind of tricky. And if you want to know it, read the book, because it's not something that's really applicable for everyday discussions or the encounters you have with people. But the how and what questions are, I think, also pretty brilliant, because when you ask, usually as pastors, we are dealing with people and how they feel. And so it's like, why you want to say, why do you feel that way? Or, why do you think you did that? And so that's just our default. So it's going to take some time and practice. It's taken me some time and practice to try and reshape things with how and what by saying, well, how is it that you were led to do that? Or what was it that made you say that? And that is just enough of a shift to have the effect on the other person that they're not going to be defensive, but they want to give you the explanation. So, and sometimes also the how questions can force the empathy from the other person, where if someone's asking you to do something, right, and they want you to do what they want you to do, a good way of having them really think about your position is to say, how am I supposed to do that? And when you say, how am I supposed to do that? It really makes them it brings them into the collaborative process by making them think about, oh, well, I didn't really think about your position on this. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of brilliant, with that. And also one thing that, I think he talks about a lot. He talks about in the book pretty well. He says, you should get to, when you're talking with somebody and you're trying to really get the, you're really trying to get the, you're trying to see that they understand, or that what you're doing is actually having, it's having the intended consequence, I guess you could say, or something like that. The intended results that you would like, that you want them to know that you hear them and that you know how they feel and all these things like that. That when you use all these things like mirroring, labeling, and the calibrated questions, you want them to say, that's right. Right. And when they say that's right, that they are aware that you get their position, right? And it says, beware for them saying you're right, because how often are we telling people over and over, and we're talking at people, like you said, and they'll say, you're right, pastor, you're right, pastor, you're right. And that's kind of a counterfeit.
That's
yes.
dismissive
Level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's dismissive.
Yeah. You're right. You're right. But if you can
right.
get them to say that's right, it makes a big difference. Because if you say, well, it seemed, and you use labeling and the calibrated questions, like, well, how do you get to that point? Or it seems like this, that, and the other, or it seems like you're really upset about this, or you're really concerned about this. And if they say that's right, then it really gives you the insight into what they're feeling and where they are. And that you're both on the same ground at that point. Yeah. It's really helpful.
Yeah, some examples of the calibrated questions were, to me, like the Good Samaritan parable. Like, he doesn't ask, why would you do that, or
right.
But who proved to be a neighbor, right. And that's kind of like a what. Which of these two was a neighbor,
right?
And made his point, or Nathan to David, what should be done with this man who did this. Instead of the immediate accusation, why did you do these things? Of course, they used parables, but by reframing the why question into how and what, not only gives you more information because they don't feel accused, but it can have the effect that they will come along and say, that's right. And you'll have an actual understanding. So, and that's the goal,
right?
Not for you to be right, but that there's an actual understanding,
right? Because that's a big difference. Someone saying you're right versus that's right. It's more objective in that sense.
Yeah.
And when you can also use like the scriptures as well, and they can say, well, that's right. All right. Yeah. So we both agree on the objectivity of the scriptures. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So beyond the techniques, he also gives some strategies to follow. And the first one I really kind of loved him talking about, which is particularly the example that he used in the book. And so I'd commend that to everyone to read. But the accusations audit, and I've done this, I think before I even read the book, where I would begin a conversation that I knew was probably going to be a little more conflict laden, and begin to say, look, I know that I've stepped on your toes, and I know that I haven't done, the best, or I know that I've offended you in the past. And so I really like this particular one. I've used this before I read the book, but give us the rundown on what he means by the accusations audit.
Yeah. So the accusations audit is really helpful when it is that, when you go for the ask on something, right? When you're asking someone to do something, he uses, what is it? He uses the example sometimes where it's like, if you're in a hotel and you need a late checkout, and you go down to the desk and you ask, and you go to the person, and before you ask for the late checkout, which sometimes, typically they won't say, it just depends, I guess. Right. But he says, you start out by saying, I'm going to make your day a nightmare. This is going to be so nerve-wracking to you. And you're just going to want to wring my neck when I'm done asking you what I got to ask you. And by the point that, when you get done with the accusations of what they possibly could say in response to your ask, then they're at a point where they just go, what is it? What is it? They're just in suspense, so that when you say, but you're going to kill me, but I need a late checkout time. And they go, oh yeah, just go ahead. What, 2, 3 o'clock? What, it's kind of funny how that works, but that's one example. Another example he uses is in the masterclass. He actually does role playing with this other woman, and they do different scenarios, right? So it's kind of neat to see how it plays out, where she plays his daughter, and he gives her the scenario. He says, you're going to play my daughter, and you're going to want to go stay with your boyfriend at his parents' lake house for like on Labor Day weekend or something like that, right? And you're going to try and convince me, your dad, to let you go. Okay. And then they just play it out. And the whole time he's accusation auditing her to death and just saying, you're going to think I don't care about you. You're going to think that I just want your life to be miserable. You're going to think that I hate you, but I don't want you going that weekend, and just, it diffuses the situation on some level, because, and he says, be bold with it, because the worst you can say about yourself, you want the other side saying you're being too hard on yourself. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So
well, that works along with his like get to know, not to yes.
Right.
Because you want them to disagree with you here.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, again, it does set the stage for, one, you recognize that you have faults,
right? And
it's giving voice to what they may be thinking and how you've handled things in the past. Because as pastors, we know we're not perfect.
Right.
We know that we're sinful. We know that we don't always have the right tone. We don't always do everything correct.
Right.
And this just gives the room for them to say, yeah, okay, one, he understands this
right
about himself. And then it also, gives them permission to agree and disagree. It puts the ball in their court instead of you driving.
Right. He talks about the he says make the other side feel like they're in control, and on some level they are, right? I mean, if it's a collaboration, both sides are having their say, and you want the other side to know that they're free to disagree, and because they should be, right?
Yeah.
And so the accusations audit is really great for that, because you can preempt these things, because sometimes as a pastor or even as a husband, you can go to your wife or whoever else and just say, you're gonna kill me. You're gonna be so upset with me about this. But I want to go eat at this restaurant or something like that. Right? It's just kind of funny how you can use this in low stakes situations to kind of see the benefit of it. And then when you're fairly well versed in it, you can even say, I kind of hate to use an example for church, because I don't want to play my hand on the situations I've been through.
Yeah, don't then.
Whatever it is, it's just like, if somebody wants to do this, that, or the other, or say this or whatever, you can use an accusations audit and just say, you're going to kill me. You're going to be so upset. Or on the other side of it, I've also heard it used this way too, that you can engage the other side in the playful, accommodating way by saying, you're going to think I'm insane for wanting to do this. Like, it's going to be just so nuts.
Yeah.
And get them to be like, what is it? What is it? And get them excited on some level too. I mean, there's different ways to use it. It's pretty amazing how many different ways you can use these things. But like you said, the getting to know question, getting the no answer is also pretty key too, if you want to talk about that one.
Yeah. Let's head to, don't avoid getting to know, or don't think that no is failure.
Right.
Because, doesn't he talks about, I think he talks about in the book, I can't remember, about there are different kinds of yeses.
Right. Yeah.
And, but there isn't a different kind of no.
Right. What does he say? There's like counterfeit yes. Yes is a confirmation.
Confirmation.
What else was there?
And then I think there's just three. The third one was like agreement to action, or actual.
Yeah. So it's, there's like actual agreement, there's counterfeit, and then there's confirmation. So it's, confirmation. Yes. Is, we're going to meet at 10:30, right? Yes. All right. That's confirmation. The agreement to action is, we've agreed on these terms and we're going to go through with them. Yes. Yes. Good. Counterfeit yes is kind of that you're right, where you're talking to somebody and they're saying, oh, you're right. That's counterfeit on some level, or it can be, right? It's not always, but it can be. Or if someone, he talks about the salesman who says, you like drinking water, right? Yes. It's like, do you like clean drinking water, right? Yes. What do you want? It's like, whenever somebody's trying to get you to say yes all the time, yes is valuable on some level, right? When you say yes to something, it's a commitment. And not everybody's comfortable saying yes right away. So what he says is that getting to know first is actually very valuable. And I even use this on the phone when I call people, and he says that he does it all the time. And everybody that in his company, whenever they pop into somebody's office or they call him on the phone, they always say, is this a bad time to talk? And, if it is, they'll let you know. But most of the time they'll say, no, it's fine. And that gives them on some level, the unspoken approval to say no. They're free to say no. And so when and that also can be used of, if you can master this, it again takes some practice, but if you can master using it by saying, would it be impossible if we tried this? Or would it be a bad idea if we maybe did this thing? And if you phrase it in those things, would it be just absolutely out of the question to do or to say this or to approach it in this way? And someone typically, if they think that it's a bad thing, they'll say, no, but this is maybe what you can tweak here and there, but it gives them, it's much more collaborative in that sense than to have you say, is this a good idea? Is this a good way to do that? And to where they're feeling pressure to say, well, yeah, but so having the other side say no, and understanding on your side that if you can help someone to say no at the outset, it actually works them toward the yes that you really need.
Really want.
Yeah.
Okay. He has a few others, like defeating fear of loss, but that's a finer point that I think we'll just have you read about in the book. And then decoding body language and speech patterns. What is that?
He does talk about it somewhat in the book. But there's two different things that he highlights. There's the Pinocchio effect, which is almost exactly what it sounds like. The Pinocchio effect is that when people are not being when people are not being straightforward with you, when they're trying to deceive or something like that, they tend to use more words, and they tend to use more words than is necessary to communicate their point. So the Pinocchio effect, and all this stuff is backed up by science and everything that he has, like the I guess it's neuroscience and
research
whatnot. The research and everything. They found that whenever someone's trying to be deceptive, they use more words to communicate their point than was absolutely necessary. And so you can kind of, that's how you can read someone a little bit. If they're coming in, I mean, you want to use one that's a tough situation and probably quintessential for us nowadays. It's just, if there's a couple that wants to get married and they're, sleeping together or cohabitating or something like that, and you're asking them the question, are y'all living together? They say, well, no. And they just go on in their explanation when a no would suffice, right? And they're just continuing on and on and on and on, or whatever the situation is, they just keep using more words than what is absolutely necessary. You can kind of at least get a sense that you need to probe a little bit deeper, right? And you need to use some of the tools to say, okay, so it seems like, whatever. Or use...
or mirror them,
Yeah. So that's one. The Pinocchio effect is kind of helpful. I haven't really had a lot of people try and lie to me, so I haven't really used that too much, but it's nice to have in your back pocket so that if you do see it, you can say, oh, I should pay attention to that. And then there's you
can see it really in your kids.
Yeah, that's right.
When they're trying to kind of cover up, you can see that they'll use more words than necessary. Mm-hmm. And then I know, okay, I need to probe this. This is not the whole truth.
Right.
And it doesn't mean they're lying to you per se. I mean,
maybe some embellishment.
They're being dishonest. Yeah, it's embellishment. It's things like that.
Yeah. And so that's just something it's useful to just know. You got to say, okay, now I gotta ask some questions because there's something missing here. I need to gain some more information. Right. And then there's the 738-55 rule. So, and I thought this was pretty good too, that in the studies they've done, they found that 7% of a person's effort is conveyed in their words, like what they're actually saying, right? So people hear, so it's like what the actual content is heard about 7% of the time. 38% of what is being conveyed is received by tone of voice. And then 55% is through body language. So your tone of voice is like more than 5 times important as what you're actually saying. Now that's not like, that's not free reign to be all flash and no substance. Of course, you have to have, especially as pastors and fathers and, teachers and husbands, you have to have the substance behind what you're saying, but what you're saying can be conveyed so much more effectively by how you're saying it. Like I said, more than 5 times important, right, than what you're actually saying. And so if your counterpart's tone of voice and body language show that they're about to lose their bearings, you can do your tone of voice to kind of rein them in a little bit, the late night FM DJ voice or whatever, and that, or just like mirror or label or something like that, use a tone of voice to help calm them down, and then so they can kind of get that bearing back, and it helps to soothe and slow down. And that's the other thing that I really think we should really pay attention to. He just wants you to slow things down. And that's really hard to remember sometimes when you're in the middle of talking to somebody, you're busy, you got all these things on your mind or on your to-do list, and someone comes into your office and starts saying, Pastor, I need to talk to you about something. You go, oh, okay. But it helps because that person's right in front of you, and those other things can take their time some other time, but this person's right in front of you and you need to talk to them. And it helps to just slow down and listen, pay attention, and use what they're saying to, lead on in whatever it is you have to do as a pastor in talking to them. And so slowing down really helps, and understanding how you're saying things is very important in comparison to what you're saying. And it's actually what you're saying is going to be received so much better by how you're saying it than you probably realize, because you can either be, we don't want to be pushovers, right? And we also don't want to be coming in guns blazing, just mowing people down. So we have to find the proper tension. I kind of I'm not a big fan of talking about balance anymore. I'm more interested in tension, because that's kind of how things have to be. You have to keep it in tension. You have to keep yourself in check. You have to keep what you're feeling from coming out sometimes, because it would be counterproductive. And so to keep those things in tension is really, really important to make sure that things don't go off the rails and that things stay productive. So
yeah, no, that's a really good point. You've got to. It's not always balance. It's about keeping the rope taut, or keeping the tension there. Otherwise, everything becomes slack.
Yeah. And if I can just add this real quick, it's kind of funny.
Yeah,
people will say, well, where, I don't want this to become purely practical stuff, because, we have to understand the theological drivings of all these things as well. And I appreciate you bringing in different things like the calibrated questions and stuff like that, that you kind of see implied in scripture with the way that Jesus talks. And I think if someone says, well, where does it say in the Bible that we should watch our tone of voice? And you go, well, the Proverbs talk about, a soft answer turns away wrath, right?
Right.
And also it's like, well, how do you think some of it has to be somewhat implied? It's like when Lazarus dies and Jesus goes to Bethany, how does he talk to Mary? And how does he talk to Martha? Or when he gathers the little children, do you think he's given them, do you think he's talking to them in the same way that he's saying the woe to the scribes and Pharisees?
Right.
Like you kind of have to read a little bit in that, but really Jesus is flesh and blood, and truly God and truly man. And I think sometimes we forget that, Jesus did talk to people differently as well. And he was very interested in conveying the word in the way that it was going to be received. Some people close off their hearts, and you can't help that, but there are ways we can kind of do the best we can to ensure that people are actually receiving what's being said. So
that's a really great point, because this is not about being nice.
Right.
This is about being creating the best environment so that you're heard.
Yeah.
And so that you can deal with what the real enemy is, and hopefully come to some resolution.
Right.
He ends the book with black swans, and I think this was the most difficult for me to try to apply to like our churchly environment or the situations that we find ourselves. Obviously, he's basing this a little bit on the Taleb book called Black Swan. Right. What does he mean by that?
Well, I think what he means is that he was a negotiator, high stakes, for a long time there, and he talks about getting to the religion of people a lot. And there was one instance where there's a guy, it's all in the book, but he talks about this one guy who drove his tractor onto the lawn in Washington, D.C., or like the National Mall or something like that in the heart of DC, and was making these demands about some legislation for the farmers. And and he was deeply affected by it. And he said he had bombs and all these things like that, but they found out that he was a Christian, and they used language to persuade him in such a way to do the right thing. Right. So for them, his black swan was that he was a Christian, and they were able to use it. And like one of the people on his team who was just there to hear what was going on and to think about how to use it to de-escalate things and bring things to the right end. She said, tell him something like, tomorrow is the dawn of the third day. Right. And that puts in his mind Christ and doing the thing that a Christian should do. Right. So on some level, a black swan, it's not necessarily always going to be applicable for us as pastors, but keeping it in mind that there are things that you may not know about somebody. There are things from on the other side that they're not telling you. They're holding close to their, chest, and not revealing, either because they think it's valuable, or it's kind of a tricky thing, because he says sometimes black swans, people hold on to them, but they don't tell them because they don't think that they're valuable, but they're valuable to you on your side, so you can understand how to approach things better or something like that. I mean, if you want to know more about it, read the book. But I think what's most important that he talks about is understanding what people's faith is. And I think for us, maybe as pastors, we can look at it in this way. If there's somebody that's in your church and they're having a problem, and you need to appeal to them in some way to get them to see a certain perspective on an issue or something like that. If you know their religion, it should be Christianity, but we all struggle with the idolatry that's all surrounding us. Some people struggle, it's like with sports, or, watching too much TV or something like that. Whatever. You can kind of use that as a way to, or you can probe that a little bit. I think that's kind of a black swan for us, is that like, if you find out what people really hold valuable, you can use that to help them understand something that they're struggling with understanding. But yeah, it's kind of a finer point. He uses it more in the business context and the negotiations, like they're holding on to something, and you need to find out what that is, and all stuff like that. But for us, it's really just getting to know people.
It's the unexpected thing that no one thought was even on the table.
Right. Yeah. It's the thing that nobody even thought was out there at all. But then once you see it, I mean, you
all makes sense.
You look back and you say, how could I have not seen that before? Right. I mean, yeah. So it's useful, but it's not something that you need to really ponder over too much. But just know that it's a possibility. Especially with sinners, right? Not everybody tells you the truth about everything that's going on in their life. So sometimes if they give a little hint at something, and I think the Pinocchio effect kind of helps figure out if there might be a black swan there that they're not telling you, or they're not divulging, and you can kind of probe.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, the name of the book, guys, is Never Split the Difference: Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It. It's by Christ Voss. Garrett, thanks for bringing this to my attention and for coming on today to chat about it.
You're welcome.
And I will put a link to the book in the show notes, and also to some of the other interviews that he's done on it. But thanks for your time and for your insight.
All right. Thanks a lot.